A listener's note. The following episode contains coarse language, adult themes, and content of a violent and disturbing nature, and may not be suitable for everyone. Listener discretion is advised.
On September 20th, 1929, people looking for a drink had come into the Study Club, a speakeasy and dance hall in Michigan. It was prohibition, so being there was risky from a legal point of view, but the cops usually turned a blind eye. But then someone flicked a cigarette butt in a stairwell. The drapes and curtains decorating the walls caught fire, and by the end of the night, 22 people were dead and another 50 were injured. It was even worse at the Rhythm Club in Natchez, Mississippi on April 23, 1940. About 750 people were jammed inside when a fire started in some decorative moss that had been sprayed with a petroleum-based insecticide. 209 people died. 200 were injured. And then there was the infamous Coconut Grove fire in Boston on November 28, 1942. Not only was the place mobbed up, but some of the exit doors were locked to prevent any unwanted wise guys from coming in. After a busboy lit a match to help him screw in a light bulb, the fake palm trees decorating the club caught fire. They were made of highly flammable material. By the time the fire department put out the flames, 492 people were dead and 130 were injured. The Coconut Grove disaster was one of the most deadly single-building fires in U.S. history. Only the fires at the Iroquois Theater in Chicago in 1903 and the 9/11 attacks were worse. These kinds of horrific events aren't confined to the U.S. Canada, the U.K., Ireland, Spain, the Netherlands, Japan, China, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, Brazil, they've all been the sites of terrible fires where, instead of having a fun night out, people died. Causes range from electrical failures to welding torches to gas leaks to arson. But if you look at all the venue fires since 2000, one thing stands out: pyrotechnic displays gone wrong. This is the story of one particular night in West Warwick, Rhode Island. It should have been a typical night of metal at a nondescript 500-person venue. Instead, it was one of the worst building fires in American history. I'm Alan Cross. This is Uncharted Crime and Mayhem in the Music Industry. And this is the very scary story of the Station Nightclub fire. When you go to a big, loud rock show, you want a spectacle. Lights, lasers, special effects, and, if all goes well, lots of pyro. Flames, explosions, smoke bombs. They all add to the theatricality of the occasion. But if you're going to blow stuff up and have open flames on stage, you got to be careful. Not only do you have to abide by health and safety regulations, local laws, and building codes, you have to be very aware of the venue itself. Can it handle your pyro? If it can't, or if you don't police the people who insist on lighting up their own munitions, the results can be deadly. And so far in the 21st century, there have been too many of these incidents. The first example of pyro gone wrong was on November 21, 2001, when a band called Armadilha do Sambo was playing in front of about 1,500 people at the Canacão Mineiro Club. This is in Brazil. The owners didn't have a business license, and there weren't any emergency exits. The entrances were blocked by turnstiles that only turned one way. Someone in the band set off some fireworks. The flames licked the ceiling, which had been coated with flammable soundproofing. And in the end, 7 people died and 197 were injured. On December 30th, 2004, over 4,000 people were jammed into the Cro-Magnon Republic, a club in Buenos Aires. That number, 4,000, was almost 3 times the venue's legal capacity. That number, 4,000, was almost 3 times the venue's legal capacity. Again, emergency exits were either blocked or locked. A band called Caballeros was on stage. A pyro flare that was part of the show ignited foam in the ceiling. 194 people died, and somewhere around 1,500 people were injured. A similar thing happened at the 911 Club in Moscow in 2007. There was another pyro accident at the Factory, a club in Quito, Ecuador in 2008. 43 people died when an indoor fireworks display went wrong at the Wuwang Club in Shenzhen, China in 2008. And if we go back to Russia, a club called the Lame Horse burned down after a pyro display in 2009. That killed 156. Those are just a few of the many pyro incidents from the last few decades. This is the story of one of the very worst, the fourth worst building fire in American history, the Station Nightclub disaster on February 20th, 2003. We should begin with the history of the venue. The station was at 211 Cosset Avenue in West Warwick, Rhode Island. The building had stood there since 1946. It was a restaurant and dance hall called Casey's and featured a lot of orchestral bands of the day. Within a year, it was called The Wheel and became a hangout for sailors from a nearby base. For the next few decades, ownership and the name changed. First, it was a place called Julio's, but there was a bad fire in 1972. It reopened in 1974 as a restaurant under the name Papa Brio's. After that, the building transitioned into Glenn's Pub in 1985. There was a final shot at food hospitality by turning the place into a sports bar, but that never happened. Instead, in 1991, it became a nightclub called Cracker Jacks, with live music, specializing in hard and heavy rock. The noise did not sit well with the neighbors, and the owners eventually sold in 1993. The music didn't go away, though. The building was renamed the Filling Station. It was soon flipped to another owner, and the entire time it remained a music venue. In its final incarnation, patrons entered through a door leading to a 6-foot-long vestibule and an interior door next to which was the ticket office. Turning right, there was a large space towards the dance floor and a raised platform that served as a stage. If you took a hard right, there was a sunroom to the right of the stage, which would also fill up with fans. At the back was a horseshoe-shaped bar with stools and padded seats. Behind the wall of the bar was a small kitchen, and on the other side of that was a room where people played darts. In other words, a pretty typical layout for a rock club this size. In March 2000, it was bought by a couple of brothers, Michael and Jeffrey Dedurian. They bought the place as an investment. By day, Michael owned a financial services company, and Jeff was a local news reporter. The name was shortened to just The Station, and business continued as usual. The new owners promised to do something about the noise problem, and were convincing enough that the local police gave them a sign-off. How did they solve the issue? Thick curtains at the back of the stage to dampen sound. False walls were built with insulated space in between the studs to keep noise from escaping the building. And finally, some polyurethane foam insulation was sprayed on the ceiling for additional sound insulation. Whenever you do renovations to a public venue that wants a liquor license, you need a mandatory inspection by the fire marshal. The first came in November 2002, and that inspector found 9 minor violations. The flammable polyurethane on the ceiling was not mentioned, apparently because the inspector was annoyed at finding an illegal exit door that swung in instead of swinging out. A month later, another inspection gave the station the all clear. Again, nobody pointed out the problem with the foam. Then again, the foam had never really been any kind of problem. In August 2002, several months before those formal inspections, the station had been host to a KISS tribute band and their pyro displays. No problems at all. The station was categorized as a Class B venue, meaning that it had a capacity of between 301 and 1,000 people. Under Rhode Island law, that meant the venue didn't require a uniformed fire person on site when anything was happening there. That would only happen if the local fire chief thought one was necessary. In this case, it was determined that if there were more than 317 patrons for a concert, then a fire detail needed to be there. The official capacity of the station, as determined by the fire marshal, was either 404 or 412. We're not entirely sure. However, there was a problem with that number. The measurements did not take into account certain standing room areas that included non-customers, which included the kitchen, behind the bar, and other places strictly reserved for employees. A proper number was actually closer to 350, although that number would later come into dispute. Some later reports had the club's capacity at 430, or 440, or 462. Whatever the true count, this still kept the station as a Class B venue. And whatever the situation, the Dedurian brothers were tired of all the hassles of running such a place. After 4 years, they were looking to get out. A new buyer had been lined up, and a purchase agreement had been signed, and the money was already in the bank. All they needed was permission from the town to transfer the liquor and business licenses to the new owners. It was just a matter of weeks or even days before they'd be rid of the place forever, and the brothers could focus on their day jobs. No more Creed tribute bands and bands like The Fix on the downside of their careers. Running such a nightclub was not a lucrative business. Rent was $45,000 a month, and revenues were about $220,000, mostly from booze and food. So by the time all the staff was paid, there really wasn't much left over for the brothers. Good riddance, they thought. Now let's turn our attention to Great White. Great White came up through the hair metal era of the early 1980s and had a couple of platinum albums, Once Bitten in 1987 and Twice Shy in 1988. The band also made the Billboard Hot 100 singles charts at least twice, including with this song. But like many of the glammy bands of the 1980s, the party ended with the rise of grunge in the early 1990s. By the end of the decade, Great White was in all kinds of turmoil. Record sales had cratered, radio airplay was on the decline, file sharing was killing them, and frontman Jack Russell had already fallen into serious addictions with drugs and alcohol. It all came to a head on November 5th, 2001, when Russell announced that Great White was done. A final show on December 31st marked the end of everything. Except that it didn't. In less than a year, Jack Russell got the band, well, some of them, back together to resume touring under the name Jack Russell's Great White. They didn't play arenas anymore, but they were booked for a series of clubs across the country. Those dates included a gig at the Station Nightclub on February 20th, 2003. The Dudurian brothers weren't expecting that big of a crowd. After all, this was only a reasonable facsimile of a band whose best days were long behind them. But ticket sales were brisk. Watching the numbers climb, Michael Dudurian was told by the police department that one cop had to be on site. A fire marshal rep was not hired. Again, this is in accordance with the station's Class B status. With things under control, Michael Dudurian left for a trip to Florida. On site that night was Brian Butler, a cameraman for a local TV station. He was there, and this is true, to do a piece on nightclub safety. The reporter on the story was co-owner Jeffrey Dudurian. Why were they doing this? Well, the report was supposed to assure people that what had happened 3 days earlier, a nightclub stampede in Chicago that killed 21 people, could not possibly happen at the Station Nightclub. Great White's set started just after 11 o'clock. We're not entirely sure how many people were in the club, but like I said, it could have been over 460, about 38 people beyond the official fire marshal limit. And at 11:07 p.m., things went terribly, terribly wrong. This is the story of the Station Nightclub fire. Great White took to a darkened stage just after 11 p.m. on Tuesday, February 20th, 2003. They started with this song. The song called for some pyro, good way to start the show. So tour manager Daniel Biscelli was in charge of setting it off. 4 devices known as gerbs. These were giant sparklers in cylindrical casings, 2 at the side and 2 at the middle of the stage, at the back by the drummer, each set up on some egg crates. These are very common fireworks, similar to what you might fire off at home for a holiday celebration. The cylinders are packed with powdered aluminum. When an electric current passes through the dust, it melts and sends off a shower of sparks. But once they're set off, they can't be extinguished. They must burn themselves out. This was the first time Great White had used such pyro effects on the road. The gerbs had been purchased at a specialty supply store called High Tech Special Effects in Bartlett, Tennessee. Total cost was about $40. The band's tour manager had used gerbs before on other tours, and each time he acquired some, he was told to make sure he got permission from the venue ahead of time, just to be safe. At 11:07 p.m., there was Biscelli's cue. The 2 gerbs at the back blasted inwards at a 45-degree angle. The 2 others, the ones at the side of the stage, sprayed upwards. This setup was called a 15 by 15. Each shot out sparklers to a range of about 15 feet for about 15 seconds. This was a problem since the ceiling was just 12 feet above the stage. The effect was to make it look like the band was walking out of a volcano. Each gerb remained on for 17 seconds. The crowd went wild. However, one of the side gerbs ignited a small fire on the wall to the left of the stage. 9 seconds later, another fire. This time, stage right was seen. After 11 seconds, the band sensed that something was wrong. By the time 25 seconds had passed, the flames were licking both sides of the stage. At 30 seconds, the band leaves the stage. At 32 seconds, everything on the platform is on fire. Jeffrey Dedurian, who was serving drinks at the bar, saw the flames out of the corner of his eye. He immediately dashed towards the stage and ran into soundman Paul Vanner heading towards the stage with a fire extinguisher. But the crowd was too thick. The music was too loud. They didn't reach the stage in time. 16 seconds after the first fires caught, the flames appeared higher on the walls and crept up to the ceiling, where they found the highly flammable polyurethane foam. Fans down front thought it was all part of the show. The band didn't seem to notice, at least at first, so there was no panic. But those at the back started to sense that something was wrong and quietly started slipping out the front door. 32 seconds after the first flames were spotted, the roof went up in a sudden whoosh. Fire spread throughout the room like someone had dropped a match into a puddle of gasoline. Smoke was everywhere. 20 seconds after the pyro ended, after the gerbs burned themselves out, the band stopped playing. Jack Russell told the crowd, "Wow, that's not good." Within 40 seconds of the first flames, the band was off stage, the fire alarms were sounding, and an emergency klaxon was screaming. However, there was no sprinkler system anywhere, and the fire alarm was not connected to the local fire department. 60 seconds after the fire started, there was thick, black, acrid, choking, impenetrable smoke everywhere. Something called a flashover effect kicked in, meaning that anything combustible in the vicinity of the original fire also ignited. Foam rained down from the ceiling, dripping flames as it fell. That foam burned at anywhere from 425 to 815 degrees Celsius. That's 800 to 1500 degrees Fahrenheit. The crowd tried to escape through the 4 possible exits: the front door, the door of the kitchen, a side door by the bar, and the stage door. A few others got out of a broken window. An orderly evacuation immediately turned into a riot. Most headed to the front, where they came in with the interior door, the vestibule, and the exterior door. But the space couldn't take the crowd crush. It was a severe bottleneck, and that exit was quickly, completely blocked. Many died or were injured. Others tried the stage door, but incredibly, a bouncer was blocking that way because he said this was strictly for the band. Other fans were able to escape through the 2 remaining doors. Within a minute of the fire starting, the West Warwick Fire Department started getting panicked cell phone calls. The fire, again, started at 11:07. First responders were on scene by 11:13, just 6 minutes later. 4 fire trucks and hundreds of firefighters showed up. Surrounding towns contributed help. Survivors were taken across the street to a restaurant for triage. By this time, the fire was completely out of control. Part of the roof caved in at 11:57. The sunroom collapsed at 12:07. It took until 1:30 to clear everyone out of the building, with many of the dead lassoed by fire department ropes and dragged out into a pile. One patron, a guy named Paul Vargas, was in that pile, but he had the presence of mind to grab the boot of a passing fireman. He was the last survivor. He'd been inside the building until 12:30, 1 hour and 23 minutes after the fire started. Remember the TV report that was being done that night, the one on nightclub safety? Cameraman Brian Butler got the whole thing on tape. Here's the audio, starting with the gerbs going off during that first song, followed by the band's reaction, the fire alarm, and the panic. Within about 90 seconds, nearly everyone still inside the club was dead or dying. The building was fully engulfed in flames within 5 minutes, which is just before the fire department arrived. It was burned to the ground in 90 minutes, leaving only a few bits of wall standing. When the casualties were tallied, and officials think that there were probably 462 people in the club that night, 96 died on the scene, with 4 more dying of their injuries in the next 4 weeks. 230 were injured, and 130 were able to escape unharmed. The dead included Ty Longley, Great White's guitarist, who tried to exit to the right instead of the left of the stage and was caught in the flames. The MC for the night, Dr. Metal Gonzalez, a DJ for a local rock station, also never made it out. 4 employees died. The local hospital was completely overwhelmed by the emergency. Many victims were transferred to other facilities, some as far away as Boston. Some suffered burns so severe that you could see the bones beneath. Families of the dead and survivors told of the confusion, the panic, the fear, and the selfless acts of heroism. A bouncer named Jody King ran in and out of the building at least 9 times over the course of 90 seconds, pulling people to safety. On the 10th time, he never came back out. His body was found 3 days later. How, everyone wondered, could such a fire happen in 2003? Finding the answers would take years. By noon on Wednesday, February 21, 2003, as the remains of the Station Nightclub still smoldered, cadaver dogs and heavy equipment moved in to continue the search for victims, especially below the collapsed floor. At this point, the number of dead was 96. Blame was immediately put on the Dudurian brothers, with the police chief telling the media that they would most definitely face criminal charges. This is only a few hours since the fire began. There had been no investigations or formal legal proceedings. The Dudurians were shocked how quickly everyone and everything turned on them. The cause of the fire and who was to blame was now being tried by the public. And because Rhode Island is the smallest state, everyone had some connection to West Warwick and the fire. Many of the survivors were destitute. They didn't have health insurance and faced months and years of recovery. Federal government disaster assistance was denied. The brothers were in shock. No one had told them that Great White planned to use pyro that night, and they were surprised to see all those sparklers going off. No permission was given to use the gerbs. And as proof, they presented the contract with Great White, which went into great detail about all the things the band needed and planned to do. There was no mention of pyro. This lines up with the testimony of Dominic Santana of the Stone Pony Club in Asbury Park, New Jersey. A few nights earlier, Great White played there and used the same pyro, but as with the station, they did not ask permission. Kevin Beese, the manager of the station, had seen pyro used in the club several times in the past, but never anything this big. He did bring this up with the owners, but every once in a while some band would manage to slip through and light something up. Jack Russell of Great White had his accounts of what happened. He maintained that, yes, the band had permission from the club to use pyro, but as time went on, his stories evolved. I was standing in the sparklers like I always do. It's not a hot flame. The next thing I felt was this heat. So I turned around and I see that some of the foam's on fire. It went up like a Christmas tree. He tossed his water bottle at the flames and then walked off stage. He says he tried to help people escape, but that someone physically restrained him, throwing him on the grass outside. It was immediately apparent to everyone that the building was not safe. The formal investigation began. On February 26, 2003, 6 days after the fire, a grand jury was convened. On December 9th, it announced indictments against Jeffrey and Michael Dudurian, as well as against Daniel Biscelli, Great White's tour manager, and the guy whose job it was to set off the pyro. Each was charged with 100 counts of involuntary manslaughter and 100 counts of involuntary manslaughter in violation of a misdemeanor. Dennis LaRocque, the West Warwick fire marshal who signed off on the safety of the station, but somehow missed the foam problem, was not charged because of a Rhode Island law that said he couldn't be charged with anything without proof he'd done anything in bad faith. Jack Russell was also not charged with anything. Attorney General Patrick Lynch was in charge of the case, saying that the disaster was caused by the flammability of the soundproofing foam the Dudurians had installed. They were blamed for having inadequate exits. The door that had been flagged for opening inwards had been reinstalled, but in the same position. The brothers claimed that they'd ordered the right flame retardant foam, but were shipped the wrong stuff by the supplier, American Foam. They got packing foam, not something fire retardant. They had no idea there'd been a mistake, so they installed it, trusting the supplier. There were no sprinklers. The only firefighting equipment in the club was a selection of fire extinguishers, all of which were useless against burning polyurethane. Proof that sprinklers would have helped happened in Minneapolis just 3 days before the station fire. A group called Jet City Fix had some pyro set off some ceiling foam, but the sprinklers immediately kicked in and everyone got out safely. So, why no sprinklers? Because when the building was first constructed as a restaurant in 1946, the building codes didn't require them. But with the subsequent renovations and repurposing of the space, sprinklers should have been installed. Another problem was overcrowding. Because the fire marshal had set several different legal capacities for the station, for example, were there pool tables in use? And if there were, that took up space. It was unclear to everyone how many people should have been allowed inside. It could have been as little as 258 or 404. And again, on the night of the fire, it said that 462 people were inside. The first trial involved Daniel Biscelli. On February 7, 2006, against the advice of his lawyer, he pleaded guilty to 100 counts of involuntary manslaughter. He'd been consumed with guilt and grief and said, "I just want to bring peace. I want this to be over with." Biscelli was sentenced to 15 years in prison, but was released in March 2008 when families of some of the victims insisted that Biscelli took responsibility for what happened and that he had no way of knowing that the sparklers would cause the building to burn down. The last anyone heard, he was married with kids and living in Florida. As for the Dedurian brothers, they jointly pleaded no contest and avoided a trial. Michael Dedurian, the brother running the club and the guy who ordered the faulty foam, was sentenced to 15 years. Jeffrey received 500 hours of community service. That was 2006. Michael Dedurian was released on good behavior in June 2009. There were other consequences, too. It started in Rhode Island, where a moratorium on the use of pyro in small clubs was mandated. This measure eventually spread across the country with new guidelines, outlined by the National Fire Protection Association. There was also a national law called the Fire Sprinkler Incentive Act, and there were a whole lot of regulations about the use of any kind of pyro, including training requirements. Beyond that, at least $115 million, and perhaps as much as $176 million, was paid out in settlements to the victims and their families. 65 different people and entities were sued. Through his company, Jack Russell offered $1 million to the band's insurance coverage. The Dedurian brothers paid out $813,000. The state of Rhode Island and the town of West Warwick were on the hook for $10 million. One of the companies that made some of the foam used in the club settled on a $25 million payout. Another, the aforementioned American Foam, the company that sent the wrong stuff, paid $6.3 million. They were never charged because it appears the grand jury never heard any of the evidence about them. It's alleged that they did know about the foam's dangers. JBL Speakers, makers of the House PA, were on the hook for $815,000 over accusations that their gear used flammable foam in its construction. The company denied that, but paid up anyway. Anheuser-Busch, the beer company, and their distributor offered a total of $21 million. Home Depot and a company called Polar Industries made a settlement offer for $5 million. Clear Channel, the owners of the radio station that promoted the show, and the employer of announcer Metal Mike, who died in the fire, paid out $22 million. And the biggest settlement is pretty strange. Remember Brian Butler, the cameraman who filmed everything that night? Was he in the way as he was filming? Was he trying to save people? Or were both things true as he tried to do his job as a photojournalist? In the end, he was accused of obstructing an exit and not helping enough people escape as he was trying to gather as much video as he could for his report. WPRI-TV had to pay out $30 million. As for Great White, they went on a benefit tour, raising $185,000. In 2010, the group split up and Jack Russell continued as Jack Russell's Great White. The next time they played Desert Moon, the song that started their set on that fatal night, was in 2013. Russell retired from touring on July 17, 2004. By August 7th, he was dead. Complications of Lewy body dementia, the same disease that killed Casey Kasem, and the one that moved Robin Williams to take his own life. The Station Nightclub fire has left a big wound on the town of West Warwick, Rhode Island. There were many memorials. The land where the building once stood is now home to a memorial and a park. You can catch up on all episodes of Uncharted by downloading them from your favorite podcast platform. If you have any questions or comments about anything you hear on this podcast, just shoot me an email. I'm at alan@alancross.ca. There are all the social media sites we can meet up on, and my website, ajournalofmusicalthings.com. It's updated with music news and recommendations every day. And there's also the free daily newsletter that you should get. Oh, and please check out my other podcast, The Ongoing History of New Music, which deals with rock music at large. There are hundreds and hundreds of episodes that you can enjoy for free. See you next time for more stories of crime and mayhem in the music industry. Episodes arrive every 2 weeks. Technical productions by Rob Johnston. I'm Alan Cross.